injection patterns and continuous validation in distributed systems. So the idea here is that as engineers, architects, developers, and coders, we're primarily focusing on making services and applications highly available, highly resilient, with zero downtime, and of course, responsive to traffic. That's the kind of stuff that keeps us up at night. That's the kind of stuff that we want to engineer into production. But the challenge is that not many services can be all these things or a combination of these things. So a solution that came up to a problem like this is that we can use microservices. We can use microservices to break out our dependencies and not have monoliths anymore. We can Dockerize everything in the Docker environments, so we'll have cloud-native architecture, and so we don't exactly push ourselves into a mess. We distribute the possibility of failure across many instances in the cloud, and that's a great thing because instances are like cattle. They live, they die. They're not like pets. We don't name them. So that's fantastic, and everything lives on this fabric of the cloud. But the reality of the situation is that as we make a system more distributed, we're making it far more heterogeneous. And if it's more distributed, then you can't exactly guarantee that it's going to be fault. There's going to be no code problems. It's going to be fault tolerant complete. There are going to be some problems, just not the ones that you're expecting. And though complete failures are rare, partial failures, they happen all the time. They're inevitable, and it's a statement of fact where you're going to see some issue happen in production at some point. So the key isn't to assume that nothing will happen, but rather assume that you can make design choices that will prevent your application from being crippled when a failure does happen. And the traditional approach to that has primarily been, handle bottom up. So handle your memory leaks, handle your exceptions, have auto-scaling clusters, have fallbacks, and perhaps fallback to fallbacks. Make stuff that's fault tolerant, that's isolated, and prevent users from getting degraded experiences, because that's probably the worst thing that you can give to your clients, which is a bad experience. And above all, just redundancies everywhere, because fallbacks can fail. Your isolated instances could potentially not be isolated. So ideally, your design your deployment infrastructure would have hooks for a lot of these issues where you continuously check bottom up, validate components, but is that really enough? So you can do unit tests, integration tests, journeys, functional tests, simulations, but in a sufficiently distributed system, is that enough to give you the confidence that your system will withstand any sort of issue in your data center? And the fact of the matter is that perhaps in a sufficiently distributed system, that's just having a suite of tests might not be enough. And we're talking on a mid-scale to large-scale web-scale system. So why is that not the case? Why can't we be confident? Well, confidence is a difficult thing because you can have traffic that is dynamic. You can have a constantly evolving data set. You can have dramatically different request patterns that evolve as your application grows. You can have asynchronous behavior. You can have concurrence. You can have concurrent applications trying to modify state. You can have really strange partial failures between threading and between different applications and different instances. And so, and all the while, your platform is growing underneath this entire thing. So it's a pretty complex challenge for us to be confident in our applications or in our system, dare I say, in production, that everything will always fail, everything will always be resilient. And so we come to the conclusion that at some point, it might not be catastrophic failure, but production will end up failing at some point. And chances are it's probably failing in some small way right now, some exceptions somewhere. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because having a distributed system mitigates a lot of those risks. But that's not a great thing because we can do better. We can definitely mitigate some of these risks. And one way of mitigating these risks is by fault injection. And that is that if we assume that a lot of these failures are bound to happen in our product environment, then perhaps we can inject failures ourselves, not on a large scale, but on a very controlled, very tame scale, extremely carefully, so that we can stress test our system and maybe even battle harden it going forward. And that doesn't mean stress testing really critical applications. That means stress testing on a very small scale and moving up as we make our applications more resilient. And in the event that we do trigger some cascading fault, then we now have a very useful KPI or metric that we can put on a dashboard that can help us identify a potential, like, show-stopping failure. So the idea here is to control this failure, control that modality, rather than assume that our application will just withstand it. And so traditionally, we've always gone through this paradigm of bottom-up testing, which is let's have a suite of tests, let's have great coverage, let's do all our integration tests, let's have performance tests, let's hook all these things into our deployment pipeline, and that's great. Because if one component doesn't pass, then the entire thing doesn't get blessed and doesn't make it out there into a production environment. But now, as we're talking more about a distributed system, where you have to test different services, you have to test interactions between different services, and perhaps even different elements in your cloud fabric, maybe different things that are happening in your queue, to messaging systems, to logs. You might end up investing quite a bit of time before you can actually see any returns in this application. And the problem with that is with almost any distributed system that if you have more parts, then are you really going to test every single piece and see how that fits into the grand scheme of your system? And the fact of the matter is, probably not as you're growing. And if you do that, then you're going to end up slowing down your velocity by quite a bit at the benefit of quality. So how do you take the curve that's inversely related to quality and velocity and shift it to the right so that you can get both quality and velocity? Well, one way to do that is by using the Simian Army, which is Netflix's chaos army. This has been around for several years now. It started with this small little guy at the center, Chaos Monkey, and then kind of just grew around him as they developed new and improved tools to help them harden their systems in production. So the idea behind this is that they make changes in production. They make small changes, albeit, but changes nonetheless, in order to figure out whether or not their application can withstand potential failures at 2 p.m. in the afternoon rather than 2 a.m. When they're out in Wrigleyville somewhere. So they try to mitigate that risk a little bit. So I'm only going to go over two of the actors in this place, Chaos Monkey and Latency Monkey, because every single one of these monkeys have a very particular role, and some of them just don't pertain to us too well. So the first guy is Chaos Monkey. So imagine a monkey, most of you have already heard this, but imagine a monkey that's in your data center, just jumping around, knocking stuff over, plugging out cables and like spying on stuff. It's indiscriminately knocking instances down. And that's what the Chaos Monkey is meant to simulate. So I have a very rudimentary service, or just very rudimentary architecture down here that I drew up in just a few minutes. So if the Chaos Monkey was released in your hypothetical data center, or your hypothetical infrastructure, then it would go around and start knocking out instances, perhaps an autoscaling group here and there, maybe even some data or stateful store somewhere. And that's the real deal behind the Chaos Monkey, is that you want to indiscriminately and randomly just knock stuff out so that you can see if your system can be resilient towards network partitions or other things. And it's not so much enjoying the havoc, it's injecting it in a very, very controlled way, so that in the event that it does happen in the future, you know exactly how to prevent against, or rather recover from an issue like that. So it's absolutely the most basic type of chaos there is out there, which is switch stuff off and see how long it takes for it to get back on. Fun fact, it actually started off at Amazon with just one bash script about 4 years ago, and now it's a full suite written up by Netflix. So there's that. Latency Monkey actually is a bit more refined, a bit more evolved and advanced. So what the Latency Monkey does is it assumes that you have this application, you have this entire system, And it has full control over sending a for injecting latencies into your system. So this actually only works if you wrap all of your requests and all of your libraries around some customized wrapper. But if you use this, and you can inject latencies at arbitrary points in your system, you can inject errors and failures in there. And so it's a bit more intelligent because now you can tinker with the service level instead of just knocking off instances indiscriminately. So by adding latencies, you can figure out whether or not, if you have districts or some other sort of load balancing, some other sort of circuit breaker pattern, then you can test whether or not your service will automatically reroute to some other command, or it would make a retry request. And you can kind of sort of simulate a more complicated pattern that your service would effectively take. And that's a good thing because now we're coming from creating this, now we're coming from knocking services off to injecting a more intelligent behavior, detecting a more intelligent failure into our service and seeing how that changes our behavior. So it is, however, difficult to run in a controlled environment, which is why many companies, including like Amazon, Netflix, and what have you, Google, they will definitely maintain a whitelist of services that just cannot be touched, so that you don't want to degrade the customer's experiences by even a little bit. So there is that. However, for the vast majority of services that aren't exactly mission critical, we can absolutely siphon off a small percentage of traffic to Latency Monkey to try to figure out how our system would behave under some sort of latency and under some sort of stress. And that's a great thing because now when we're injecting stress, we can actually mimic our system at peak loads. But like I mentioned earlier, it's still somewhat random. So how do you make an experiment out of this? How do you take sample size A and sample size B, and how do you compare them? Well, the challenge is with Latency Monkey, you can't, not just yet. So how does this kind of play into the big picture of fault injection? That's because Chaos Monkey came first. Chaos Monkey came first with simple knocking services off, on and off, and seeing how your system can respond to stuff that's offline. And then after that, Fit came, and then after that, Latency Monkey came in, and it was a bit more intelligent, a bit more directive, but then grew out the entire Simian army. It's evolving, it's getting smarter, it's knocking off health check, it's fudging with health checks, it's knocking off your data centers, it's doing something in your availability zones, it's doing intelligent garbage collection for you, and it's getting smarter because now you have an entire suite to simulate a very wide assortment of behaviors that you wouldn't otherwise be able to simulate. But it's not quite there yet because we don't have a precision tool, and that's FIT, that's fault injection testing, which is a much more precision kind of tool. And the reason why it's so, the reason why FIT is the next stage in the Simian army evolution is because FIT will intelligently add headers into your request, and those headers, based on something like Zool, would transfer to your edge servers and go only to very particular services. So you can customize FIT for a very small segment of applications, and not just applications, but users and devices and regex patterns. So it's far more directed. It's more of a scalpel. So it has request level simulation, and it has targeted failure injections. So in the same system that we had before, if we were to utilize FIT, then we would have some sort of device or account level override that we would pass in as a header. And by passing in that as a header, we will effectively limit the failure to only one chain. So using this, we can isolate, we can test failures in a much more careful way, and not stress the entire system through this random barrage of just failure modes that we have injected everywhere. And that's the real advantage here with it. It doesn't, but to do this, we would actually need some sort of failure modality. We would need some sort of intelligence on what failures our system could potentially undergo. And that's where continuous validation comes in. We can leverage the Simian army, or rather, institutions do leverage the Simian army and FIT in order to build rudimentary continuous validation strategies. This over here, as I'm going to go over, is a pretty basic one. Of course, companies have worked to make them far more advanced than I can probably cover in several hours. So how would this work? Well, the Simian Army, as we mentioned before, generates a series of random injections that would be applied to your application, and then you would test how your application behaves to these series of failures. And that's great because some will stretch your application out, and some your application will recover from. And there are others that would absolutely cause your application to crap out and behave in ways that you just did not anticipate. And that's fine, because now you know ways in which your application might not be as performant in a production environment. And that's great because you can use that data to build fit injection headers, and you can have an entire assortment of new tests that you can run routinely on your application in order to check how it, in order to figure out how it behaves in order to figure out how your production environment behaves given these conditions. So that way you can have a very rudimentary continuous validation strategy where you constantly perturb the system, and if you would ever find a modality that just wouldn't work, you can add that to your set, you can add that to your data set of tests. You can repeat that until you're absolutely confident that your system is hardened against that sort of behavior. Like your system will never go down if you have a peak traffic at 7 p.m. when Super Bowl is happening, because you've never had that issue before, and all your tests have indicated that you're never going to have that issue. And that's fantastic, because now you can have continuous deployment to your platform and to your distributed system, and you can also have a continuous validation strategy to make sure that your application, your system is as hardened as it can be in the given time frame without sacrificing too much velocity to go back and build meticulous testing suites for everything. And that's a different paradigm than bottom-up approach, because with top-down, if our system withstands an injection, it's good. We're confident in it. It's fantastic that our system can withstand bad stuff happening to our notification queues, because our autoscaling group can take care of that. It's okay that we don't have 100% test coverages for everything, because if something does go wrong, apparently we have stuff with load balance that can mitigate this sort of risk. And that way, for a given investment, we can have faster returns. Of course, this is primarily for a distributed system, but and this entire paradigm is different than before. Whereas with bottom-up approach, if one particular aspect, if one particular component did not pass, you have to fail the entire deployment. But in this case, if one component didn't pass, but your system still behaved within your acceptable parameters, you're fine with it. You're not going to sacrifice that sort of velocity for the fine-grained quality. So that's the advantage of top-down approach. So we said that we can, with failure testing, identify failure modalities. We can generate very useful KPIs. We can validate the performance of our system, and we can gain confidence in the behavior of our applications. And that's fantastic, because that's what we want as devs. We want to gain confidence in what we're making, that it's not going to break in production. It's going to withstand the trials of time and means, whatever have you. But in a sufficiently web-scaled distributed system, you may not have that luxury. It might be far too complicated for you to even start to consider how stuff may interact, how failures may come up, how your second degree services may interact, how your third-party scripts are tweaking with all of your logs, and it gets quite complicated, especially in a very large distributed system. And so some of the issues that come up with fault testing is that startup resiliency is always an issue. And that's because state is a very pesky thing. And if 95% of your problems can be solved by restarting your service, then you should probably think about state more often. And service engineers also don't know all the dependencies of their system that they're building. Perhaps some of their dependencies have changed. Maybe they're using latest instead of a very particular version. We don't know. maybe the contract between the services have changed, all that sort of thing. Fallbacks can fail. Your secondary fallbacks might not be enough for your application to withstand some sort of like 10-fold increase in traffic. And again, second-order effects are very complicated. You can't exactly predict everything that's going to happen. And especially in an asynchronous system with reactive applications, it gets even more challenging for us to figure out where all the different patterns of this application failing. So with dependencies being in a constant flux, we can't give any guarantee, let alone be confident that our system would, given any massive change in production, be able to withstand this sort of test. So what this really boils down to is the blast radius problem. Everything works very well when it's a small component, but when it's an application, it's somewhat still acceptable. But when it's a great big system, then it gets very complicated for us to figure out all the different ways, the probabilities, permutations, and combinations that this thing can be participating in. M is a possible perturbations per service, just averaging out. You have n to the power of m different perturbations, and in a distributed system, that's a huge number. So it gets very challenging very quickly in a distributed system, even with fault injection, for us to gain confidence in whatever we're building. And the concern there is that distilling this down, how do we gain confidence? Well, we can probably validate the application stability. Well, how do we validate the stability? We can probably find failure modes and harden it against those. Well, how do you find failure modes? It's because we need to find counterexamples to our logic and our behavior. So if we're boiling everything down to finding counterexamples to particular outcomes, then I think we're getting somewhere. Then we can probably develop some intelligent system or somewhat intelligent system to help us out to do what we want and enter lineage-driven fault injection. So what lineage-driven fault injection says, or the assumption that it makes, is that instead of starting from failures and moving towards outcomes, let's flip that around. Let's start from an outcome and move towards failures. So instead of asking the question, could bad things happen, we're asking questions like, why is the application stable? Everything just passed. Why did it just pass? What could have gone wrong? What had to have gone wrong for this thing to fail? And so, in order for this thing to work, we need to figure out a component call graph. So we can use whatever application we want. We can ignore whatever methodology we want. We can use tracing, logging, whatever tracking at the JVM level to figure out an entire call graph of our application. And we start with an outcome. So that's the central point. So that's the green box. We start with one outcome, and we move our way across the entire call graph and try to figure out all the different interactions that have to have happened for that one outcome to work. So in this case, everything that's blue is another dependency, and the edges are decisions that have to have been made. And yellow over here is indicative of a critical dependency. So if you block off the yellow, then that means your outcome will not happen. So already you can see that, yeah, this thing is terrible. Like it's going to fail in many different ways. You can block off any one of these aspects, and your application, your outcome would just not work. However, if you blocked off just a small segment over here in blue, your application might still work. So the idea here, taking this principle and figuring out a call graph and finding all the weak links in that graph, we can work with that. Because now we can, outcome by outcome, identify whether or not our system can handle a failure. And so the key principle here is understanding that we're not exactly injecting a lot of issues into production. Now we're just generating a graph, and we're doing analysis on that to figure out whether an outcome can be stable. And so, because of this, we can use our algorithm to find very interesting paths down our graph, and we can quickly either find all those failures, or we can guarantee that our system is so redundant that you probably won't have any failures like that. If you knock any of these edges out, then your system will still have enough redundancy for your outcome to be solid. And that's different than randomly injecting all these different failures and generating a list of headers that you can now use to inject back into your system and having a continuous validation strategy. With fault injection, I'm sorry, do you have a question?
I just, when you, in the previous slide, you had the graph, and when I was looking at that, I was thinking of it in terms of where you'd actually put tests for a guarantee as opposed to confidence. Is this strategy to figure out where you need redundancies? Is that what it's for?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the primary goal here is to find redundancies in your graph, so that if you were to knock one vertex or edge out, then you still have enough, well, not circularity, but enough redundancy to reach your critical dependencies. So that's the real idea, redundancy. Of course, I mean, redundancy doesn't exactly equate to the auto scalability. So some stuff does fail. So there's that. But this is a very new concept. It's only been around for maybe a year so far, and it's a very experimental, used in only maybe 1 or 2 firms so far. So there's that. But it's a step in the direction of identifying how a distributed system could potentially be tested to almost guarantee, or at least get very confident that it's going to work under any perturbation. So there's that. And Molly, of course, is the name of this application that the researchers at Berkeley made. So it uses lineage of your application to track whether or not it can give you sufficient guarantees that it's going to work given some sort of injection. And that's really what we want in this case. So because we went initially, if you remember, we went initially from chaos to latencies to an entire assortment, an army, and now we went to failure injection. It's very, very customized, very fine-grained, like a scalpel, surgical knife. And now we're going to predictive, to a predictive test before we even get in the operation or something else. So it's, as we're moving towards failure, there's many different kinds of failures. So we can many different kinds of failures in production that we can sort of leverage in order for us to tune how we want to harden the behavior of our product environment. And all that depends on the kind of application we're building. And of course, it's a very new field. It's only been around for a couple of years at best. So there are quite a few academic problems that the community as a whole is still trying to solve. Some of them include, search prioritizations. How do you, if you have an n to the power of n matrix that we mentioned before with the last radius, how do you intelligently find maybe a minimum or a maximum that to find a stable point or a really unstable point? If you're solving that problem, which I think Uber is right now, if you use some sort of call graph, then how do you, and you have a very distributed system, how do you trace that? How do you find redundancies very quickly? And how can you do that for many different outcomes very quickly? Of course, we need to also integrate this property-based testing, which hasn't quite been done yet. And there's also the problem of collecting very rich lineages, which seems easy, but in a sufficiently distributed system, it's a nightmare to accumulate all that to one particular outcome. And then there's probably what I consider like the hardest problem, which is to measure success, because success seems intuitive, but for quantifying that, as a quantifiable metric, it's kind of difficult to identify what success truly means. I don't personally. I can't think of a cutoff that I'd say 10 milliseconds is a success. I might say that everything, like 95% of your requests, if they're less than 10 milliseconds, that's a success. So that number or that metric is very hard for me to quantify, and that's very hard for the industry as a whole to quantify, because success can change based on applications. And if you have a distributed system, then how do you have a distributed success metric? So some academic problems that are still being worked on, and hopefully in the future, someone Russian will figure them out for us. So, I mean, it's probably how it's going to end up working. So the key takeaways are that we shouldn't wait for random failures to happen in production. Instead, if we can mimic some of these failures on a very small scale in production, then we should probably do it in order to figure out how our application or our system can potentially fail or respond under that sort of stress. And we can use uncertainty to our advantage by injecting it at 2 p.m. rather than 2 a.m. on an inconvenient weekend night. And by injecting failures like this, we can harden our system to, harden our production system to stuff that may or may not happen in a real environment. And that's the real key here, is that failure testing shouldn't exactly be some fringe science. It should actually be integrated as a continuous validation strategy for a very distributed system, so that we can gain confidence in our work and perhaps think better at night. And these guys, the simian monkeys, are not our enemies, despite the damage they're doing. They are our friends. So with that, if there are any questions,
Can you quickly enumerate some of the other members of the army?
Sure. So this guy is, like I go from the top, this guy is Chaos Kong. He takes data centers offline, or no, availability zones offline.
Wow, the whole availability.
He's a mad guy. He's pretty funny. That's the Chaos Gorilla. He'll take data centers offline. So it's on a smaller scale. That's his bazooka. I don't think this guy's anyone. This is Chaos Monkey. That's Latency Monkey. That's, I think, what's that? Dr. Monkey? I forget what he's called. But what he does is he screws with health checks. So he's very, very meticulously messes with us. And that down here is the janitor monkey, who scans through all of your active resources and figures out the ones that are not being used and cleans them up. I don't know who this fellow here is. I don't know if he is.
Let's just talk about him.
Yeah, we don't know what he does.
He's the agent.
This goes around.
He mutates.
Is there anything that does like sort of header injections and things like that across various services?
So actually, what I talked about failure injection testing, they're open sourcing that. They haven't gotten around to it yet because it's so new.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, failure injection testing does solve quite a few problems, because we can do very, very customized, very customized header injections and failure tests. But since we're testing this, it's still a little challenging, because you have all of your logs that are indicating some changes in behavior, and then you have some logs that are not quite that indicate your perturbed system a little bit, and so it's still not really easy for us to do some sort of like alpha test or something like that, two-tailed test, to figure out whether or not there's the same samples. So the next thing that I think the people who actually built this are working on is a system called Chat, which is it's even more evolved, because what it'll do is it'll replicate instead of just building a header, it'll replicate that slice of your system into its own small little VM or container, and then it's going to give requests to your system at your system and the replicated system, and figure out how your system behaves as a whole. And so you can very easily then tell and compare those two paths, and figure out, hey, we made some changes in this application, and we replicated the entire thing, and we duplicated the request between the one path and the other path, and it seems like if we take something off, some major change does happen, because we're not deterministically not making that decision. We're actually replicating everything and duplicating the requests and making that and observing that request. So it's not that quantum uncertainty thinking. It's just absolute facts.
I get one question. So it seems like it's more of a you're putting dye and trying to figure out the blood flow kind of a thing. I'm just curious. Maybe it's not scope of your presentation, but for the most part, it's redundancy is an answer that you can figure out what the weak point is and put more horsepower there. However, I'm just curious, what exactly would we do for latency issue? Like, if we figure out there is a latency issue, how do we go about that without, or perhaps it's, maybe I'm answering my own question.
No, that's a pretty valid question. It's the same reason why some of the companies that are using a latency injection, and that includes, not just Netflix, but Amazon and Jet.com, they all have a whitelist that cannot be touched, because they just don't want to sacrifice that sort of latency. They don't want to inject any latency in there. It's a tightly maintained system that they're very confident that they're never going to get that latency up. But to answer your question, how you test something like that, there are circuit breaker and command and other bulkhead counters that a framework Hystrix, well, you must have heard of Hystrix. Hystrix can leverage in order for us to figure out whether or not a certain time has been passed and probably reroute that request to some other actor in your system. And there are other patterns that take this even further, where instead of using a different command entirely in your circuit, it'll make a retry. It'll retry that to a different availability zone, and then have some sort of grace condition between whoever comes back first. And so it's there are several ways that we can leverage redundancy in order for us to really stress test latency. But this all comes down to how critical is it for you to get that one piece of data back? Can you potentially get something that's a little bit more stale back? Can you maybe, instead of generating like a very customized recommendation from your service, can you get the top 10 recommendations? Okay, that's not good enough. Maybe you can get a recommendation you stored at runtime in some states. So it all depends on what your application's boundary are. And this production semi-army testing will only bring that to the surface, bring that issue to the surface. How to solve that, that's entirely up to the applications designers themselves.
What are some gaps that you think, I don't know if you've thought about this, but gaps between where we are now here at CARS versus where we can start using some of these techniques and getting some traction on them?
So, I mean, the real thing over here is, well, what Netflix and what those companies that really spearheaded this, what they started off with, as I understand, is that they started really small with making their services relatively fault tolerant, and when they were confident enough that it could survive this sort of fault tolerance, then they started like beating them with a baseball bat. So I think the key for us at CARS, would be to build services that we would assume can potentially fail. And I think the listings API is a great example of this, because when Michael and Z rebuilt this Hystrix command patterns, that pretty much made sure that if something did fail, there was a timeout, there's redundancies of redundancies. And that's fantastic, because now with listings API, we could potentially fail some of its components and see how it behaves. But the key thing for us to start is to use some of these redundant patterns, or some of these fault tolerancy patterns, and once we can leverage them, then potentially we can be confident enough to start switching things off or dialing them back a little bit to the first round of testing. Sweet. Okay, I guess that sums it up then.